Hello, everyone. It's Shane Kanto, your Wasteland reviewer, and welcome to the Wasteland, my weekly show where we take a deep dive into a particular film. And we're back for another war. And John Ford doing some documentary work with This Is Korea. And joining me after really helping out with a whole bunch of other ones for World War II is my buddy Jim. Jim, thank you so much for coming on.
Hello, internets. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for those who haven't tuned into the show before, we have three segments. So we have our coming attractions for the week of August 9th. We're in the thick of it, that last month of summer where the most random stuff comes out. And then we'll be chatting about This Is Korea, our feature film. And then we have some recommendations for you. So diving in. So the biggest film coming out this weekend is certainly Borderlands. So they're finally hopping on that video game adaptation train and releasing a Borderlands movie with some casting that I feel like a lot of fans are confused about, which I've never played the game. So I'm like, oh, Kate Blanchett and Jamie Lee Curtis are in this. And people are like, but why? And then Kevin Hart, too. That is not the film that either of us are most interested in. Jim, what are you most excited for coming out to recommend to people?
I got to see a film called Good One at Sundance last year. Um, it's it's a gentle film, very subtle, takes its time. There's a lot of, so to give you some context, all right, a girl
Mhm.
takes a backpacking trip into the Catskills, which are lovely. It makes a really nice landscape for a movie with her dad and her dad's like lifelong best friend. And then things get a little bit complicated, but it's there's a lot that's left unsaid that you kind of have to glean or unpack or kind of empath, yourself. So it's kind of a quiet film, but it can be powerful if you really get what's going on. So I don't want to really say too much about the film, but it's not melodramatic. It's not going to be no jump scenes or anything like that. It's paced very well, um, but it still has a lot to say um, about growing up and about filial relationships and kind of the lengths and shortcomings of what those relationships can do for you. How about you,
Awesome.
Shane? What are you excited about seeing this weekend?
I am excited to go see Good One. I was not able. I got invited to a press screening in New York City. I'm like, well, that's a trek. So I didn't go. I don't generally go to them in New York because honestly, with work, I can't really get there in time. But I'm most excited about Cuckoo. I really believe 2024 is going to go down as one of the best years of modern horror. There's been so many great films coming out this year, horror related, and even the ones that aren't the best, or at least getting attention. Like I wasn't the biggest fan of Trap. I had a fun time. It's a messy movie, but Shyamalan. But this film, Cuckoo, focuses on this young woman played by Hunter Schafer of Euphoria fame, and her family is brought to this kind of compound or something isolated by Dan Stevens' character, which I love Dan Stevens. After Abigail earlier this year, I can't wait to see what he does in this one. And it seems like there's these strange humanoid beings that are like stalking the people in this compound at night. And you only get fleeting glimpses of them, but they look freaky from what you can glean from the trailer. This trailer worked so well, getting my attention. So I'm super excited about this one. So we'll see if it's just as scary as the trailer makes it out to be, which it's always the hope. If it's a horror movie, you want it to scare you. So, and
I
not in
still
a cheap
haven't
way.
I still haven't seen Euphoria. I'm so behind the times. Like
Well,
I don't
you'll
even
have
recognize
plenty
this
of
girl's
time
face.
before the next season ever comes out. So I just feel like television just gets longer and longer in between seasons and stuff like that. It feels normal to have like 2 year gaps between seasons of shows, and it's just like this is ridiculous because there's just too much content. But now
How
Hunter
long have we
Schafer,
been waiting for Peaky Blinders, the movie? How many years has it been now?
um, I was like, this is ridiculous, and then they announced Rebecca Ferguson's in. I'm like, I'll wait, and I'm like, because after I saw her in a film earlier this year with Liam Neeson, this Irish thriller, I'm so ready to see Rebecca Ferguson playing a villain again. Between Doctor Sleep, this, I don't know if she's going to be a villain in this. I hope she is
She
because
was in Dune, right? She's
yes,
the mom from Dune. Yeah.
correct. She's incredible. Top tier work. Rose the Hat from Doctor Sleep. Really loved her in that. But there's definitely some really great horror coming around, and it's interesting seeing Hunter Schafer kind of like leaping from television, even though it's HBO, it's still television, and getting like a big starring role in horror, like a indie horror film. Because and this is Neon's putting this one out. So
Okay.
Neon's having a good year. Long Legs just cracked like $80 million. It's their highest grossing film of all time. So they're cooking. But in other news, we have a documentary war film, and this is obviously from director John Ford. This is Korea, which is a 50-minute film focusing here, and we have narrators John Ireland and Ward Bond. There's not a Ward Bond sighting, but you hear his voice. Um, but Jim, what were your general thoughts on This Is Korea?
I'm glad you brought up the narrators because that was my first question mark on the sheet. The narrators were, can you repeat it? John Ireland and
John Ireland. There's actually, it looks like three. John Ireland, I think, is the primary one. Alan Dwan, and then Ward Bond
Ward
is also
Bond.
in there somewhere.
Okay.
Esteemed character actor of many John Ford films, Ward Bond.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So going into any propaganda film, you have to kind of set you got to make your presets, where you want them as to
Yep.
like what you want to absorb, what you want to be open to, and what you want to be critical of, and where you want to, put your reading glasses on. Um, I know, I think less about the war in Korea than I do about any other conflict in American history. And I think that might have something to do with the fact that it was kind of just unsensational and not successful and
And it's
not
not over.
glorious. And it's right, exactly, it's still going on.
It's not
Um,
over because they never actually stopped fighting.
sure. But I did
And
notice some similarities between
okay.
this and the previous. So the moral high ground, that's what they
Yes.
go for immediately
Hmm.
with the kids.
Yes, manipulative. Yes, elitist. Yes,
Sure,
where it's
sure.
like we are feeding these poor, starving children, not their own countrymen. It's like, wow, America. So,
True. I mean, true. And then when they talk about the North Koreans
mhm,
or the commies, I guess let's
yeah,
call them communist North Koreans, or even the Soviets. Like we didn't really know who we were fighting, did we? Was it the Chinese? Was it the Soviets? Was it Koreans? Like there was maybe that's a reason we don't see the enemy at all in this
mhm,
film. Um, but yeah, we refer to the enemy as those people several times. So it's, yeah, we feed the children in this country, and we shoot the bombs at those people over there who we never ever
yeah,
see. Not even corpses, which they did
mhm,
show in the last documentary we talked about in World War
yeah,
II, right? Um, one that would be the difference, I think. The glaring difference to me between this one and the others is that the enemy is never shown, not even once. Like for all we know, they were shooting at, just empty hills and putting it on camera.
yeah,
Obviously, you have to assume that it wasn't, but
yeah.
that's the biggest difference I think between this and the other ones we saw. Um, interesting. Uh, lots of specs. Like for people who are interested in weapons and
Mhm.
warfare, there's a lot of good stuff here to be had. 75 millimeter guns, 30 caliber guns. There was one there was one time he mentioned certain caliber guns that blow up like something else, like they make
Yeah.
such a big splash. Names, lots of big names, generals and admirals and vice admirals, and a couple of weird quotes that I'll bring up later
Mhm.
when you give your thoughts. What did you think of This is Korea after John Ford's World War II films?
I did feel like right off the bat they were going like you alluded to and brought up like this idea of like we are the moral like good side in this situation. And they went straight for kids from the start. I'm like, yep, well, manipulating. And it's interesting because like it's front loaded. A lot of the film is that kind of piece to the film. And then they went into a lot of warfare and battle stuff like that. You brought up like talking about the weapons and stuff like that. They rolled out Douglas MacArthur, and which you're not going to find many bigger names to roll out at that point in terms of like name dropping military people for the United States. And was Eisenhower president yet at this point? I feel like
That's an excellent question. I
because
think
it was either Truman or Eisenhower at that point. Um,
it might have been nice. I'll fact check you. Keep going.
yeah, but it's one of those kinds of things where you also brought up an interesting point of like we never see the enemy, so like how realistic is the warfare they're showing? It's visceral for
Mm.
sure, and it's exciting, and then it's like, but was it staged? And how much of it was like we're really seeing the battling and stuff like that. They certainly lean into that a lot. Especially in like the latter half of the film is really showing the warfare going on, which for me, if that's interesting and compelling, because that's the obviously we're going to get the propaganda biased message of the film, but if the film can show impressive uses of like the visual medium that it is, that's something interesting to me for like a war documentary, because that's why we're here, like watching a war documentary, not to be like most Americans were already like, "Oh, rah, USA." You're here to feel what the soldiers are going through and the experience that they're doing. Obviously, they're doing the hard sell, trying to paint the United States. We're not the aggressors here. We're there to save these kids and save Korea. And then it really gets into like the meat of it, which is the warfare.
Yeah.
And I've watched some interesting documentaries recently, but outside of just the John Ford ones, of like some visceral warfare being shown on the screen. And like, that's something we can't experience unless, we put our lives on the line and go into the military. So
Mhm.
being able to see that brought to life, it's thrilling, it's exciting. And John Ford's made narrative films highlighting the exhilarating, dangerous warfare of like the ocean and stuff like that and World War II. And now it's find it very interesting that this is like a quick in and out one film about Korea. Because like John Ford did how many films? Like five, six films about World War II. Obviously, Korea, like you mentioned, is not one of the most memorable conflicts that America's been in, but it is important in the fact that it's the context of this was our first like shot against the world of communism, that the United States decided that we were going to fight for decades. And this was really, this in Vietnam were like the main conflict, like actual conflicts involved in it, besides,
Yeah.
a lot of Cold War and a lot of like shaking big weapons at each other.
If you want to look back at the century in kind of large on a large scale, macro terms, I think
Mhm.
this film might be the most interesting just because of everything that was happening, this like you said, this is the start of the Cold War.
Mhm.
um, Communism is this kind of phantom, formless threat that's just creeping in to places that we're not familiar with, and maybe we shouldn't be going with the equipment that we have.
Yep.
um, I was reminded, when I read about, this might have been back in high school, like when I first read about Vietnam, I remembered that they were fighting with gear from the Korean War, like the
Mhm.
same machines from this conflict were sent into Vietnam in the initial skirmishes there, which is crazy. But
Like
and I'm sure
almost
most
20
of these
years
machines
old.
were World War II machines
A
as well.
hundred
So like,
percent.
yeah.
Like it's like, well,
But
we already
everything
had it
that
out there.
happens from here, yeah, it's, I mean, this is a big landmark. And the fact that it's 1950, it's like right in the middle of the century. So
Yep.
there's a lot that we could talk about as far as Cold War goes, and probably fit in Oppenheimer slyly if you wanted to at some
Mhm.
point. So Truman was president when this was
Okay.
filmed. The war officially ended in 53, which was the same year that Eisenhower took power, which
Yep.
is interesting to me because he was the war hero.
Yep.
But Nixon was vice president, so there's your segue into the Vietnam
Conflicts
era.
to come.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's such an interesting context because yeah, this was in the 20th century. You had pre-World War II and post-World War II. And this is such an interesting time because John Ford's going to be making films that are not highlighting the idyllic like place where America sees itself. It's he's still making war films. He's still making the wild, wild west kinds
Yeah.
of films and stuff like that. Obviously, his next film's a little bit more like, people are done with all that kind of stuff. Let's make a Quiet Man. Make a nice Irish film. But like John Ford never really was the kind of director that made consistently films that are like sweet time kind of films. It's like it's always looking at conflict and serious conflict. Because even most of the westerns that he made, a lot of them are war films too. It's just, smaller scale against Native American tribes and stuff like that, and not like, oh, in the history books we have this war, that war, that war, this war. It's those
Right.
specific events that happen. And this is an interesting like diversion for a bit in between coming off of doing more westerns and then bam coming in with this film. And obviously it wasn't a whole big to do of like all these directors going into the military and making all these films. It was like a one-off thing.
Yeah. Do you know if he had
Just
to re-enlist for the Korean War, or if he
that's a good
if he kept his
question.
if he kept his rank, like from World War II to this one?
I'm assuming he kept his rank. I don't know much about like military procedures and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
like his first film after World War II had his rank and everything in the credits. Which was an interesting choice to show like his connection to the war. But like
Hmm.
this film kind of feels like I guess an appendice to like his career as a war documentarian. Because like he never does anything like this again. To be frank, by the time Vietnam rolls around, John Ford's filmmaking career was waning by the
Hmm.
mid '60s and stuff like that. But this was like what that one extra little time to be able to shoot a film at war, capturing the visceral nature of it. And that's the thing. John Ford knows how to capture action. And he certainly does that in this film. It's just to what point is it actual action? And, you know, watching the United States military fighting actual enemies, which honestly I didn't really think too much about the fact that like and then you brought up that we don't really see the enemy. And that's the thing. World War II is the most moral war that we've had since what, the revolution and the War of 1812.
Yeah, even even then, debatably, we we were just rabble rousers who were staging a revolution, which is, I mean, when you codify it, they even put it into this film. The one of the narrators says that they're fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes.
The individual soldiers, they were very clear about that. Like if you ask the Marines what they're fighting for, they may not be able to tell you clearly in words. They
No.
probably didn't have a damn clue, of the political internet, the socio-political schemes that were going on. But he kind of puts words in their mouths and he says they're fighting for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I was like, I wonder how many of those soldiers that actually was true for.
Which I thought that was very interesting because yet again, it's us putting our thoughts, our perspectives, what we value in America onto another nation. It's
Yeah,
like we're fighting for this for you. And it's just like, do we ask for it?
it's kind of the start of a long and infamous tradition of America asserting those values in very violent ways in foreign countries, right?
And none of them will ever match the significance of World War II because there was legitimately evil, like very clear black and white kind of like Hitler is bad. Like that's one of the most easy statements to make in history is
Right.
that Hitler was a
To be an
bad person.
anti-fascist is not exactly to put yourself out there on a limb these days, right? That's pretty easily
Or
defensible.
well, I don't know about these things. We're in
Yeah,
an interesting
right. Good
time.
point.
We're in an interesting time in
Well, they
history, in
wouldn't they
American
wouldn't
history.
use that term. They wouldn't be like, "Oh, we're the fascist party." They would, it'd be a little
No,
bit
just
more
neo Nazis, but whatever.
to each their own.
But to the point of, it is fitting that we don't see the enemy because, like, what is the enemy in this? Because what was communism but a specter that was just floating over, like, giving James Bond some credit.
Yeah.
The looming evil was a specter. Like, what is it? It is an amalgamation of all these different people that we lumped together because, like, they're anti-American. And you were right. It's like, is it the North Koreans? It's the Chinese. It's the Russians. And where else is communism popping up that we're gonna, stick our nose into? And the fight at home, quote unquote, communism, and the Red
Yeah.
Scare, and John Wayne,
And
and
John
Huac.
and McCarthy and yeah.
Yep.
Well, speaking of John, I want to come back to John Wayne in a second. Um, to give Karl Marx credit, I think he was the one who actually called communism a specter to begin with, like the OG communist, if you will. Like,
Yep.
and it's true. Like, it's not a national threat. You know what I mean?
It's an
It's
idea.
it's yeah. It's an existential kind of a threat, and it really freaked people out. And it fucked things up as far as international relations goes through the 20th century. But as far as John Wayne goes, there was a general pictured called
Mhm.
Chesty Puller. I'm assuming Chesty is his nickname. But hearing the quote and seeing his mannerisms, I was like, that's
Oh,
John Wayne. Like that John Wayne could be that guy,
yep.
And while we were having this conversation, I just saw that Ford made a documentary called Chesty, a tribute to a legend. This was in '76.
That's his
So
last. That will be
it was his
the
last
last
film.
film. The last
Really?
film that I'll be doing on this journey through John Ford.
You'll be so relieved to get to Chesty.
Yep,
So
100%.
I was really curious, like if how much inspiration Ford took in his direction of John Wayne from this guy, Chesty Puller, because it was just so reminiscent to me of all the
Well,
things I dislike about John Wayne, to be really frank with you.
that's okay. You're in the same club as my wife, Jess. uh, hating John Wayne. Um, I, as a person, what he stood for was so hypocritical and such BS. Like a man that's so proud, like Scott went to so many lengths to get out of serving in World War II, will go then and call other people un-American and stuff like that. And then trying to create this moral high ground of nothing. Like that's the issue. Even to the point where like John Ford negged him and abused him on set because he did fight World War II. Even
Yeah.
John Ford isn't going to put up with his crap. And it's such an interesting. There's so much cultural context around John Ford and John Wayne. In it's like what John Ford, so many of his films represent is that Americana kind of idea, and there's so many people today who are still fishing for that. Like they want that back, that ideal, and that's the America they want to bring back. And it's so interesting in 2024 thinking about like it's such a different world. Like
It
the
really
world that
is.
we live in is like between 1951 and like the Korean War and stuff like that, we're so much more global because of the news and because of social media. There's so many conflicts going on in the world at once. It's hard to just focus on like we got our one war that we're focusing on, and you have the Ukraine, you have Palestine, and so many other things going on in the
Yeah, there are
world.
like multiple wars going on in Africa right now that like
Yep,
I couldn't
that
even
nobody
tell
pays
you.
attention to.
I couldn't even tell you who's involved. I just know they're going on, you know?
It's an interesting idea, and I that's very interesting that you looked into that. And yeah, Chesty is the last film that I'm going to be highlighting on this run through John Ford because like that was like by and large his last film coming out well like
Hmm.
halfway into the 70s at that
Okay.
point, which just context, John Ford started like directing in 1914. So that is a long ass time to be
Yeah, it
directing
is.
films and just solidifying himself as such a big part of film history.
Yeah.
And we were chatting a little bit about Martin Scorsese and his influence on documentaries. I always find it interesting when you see uh, like an iconic filmmaker who also can be a talented and effective documentarian too, because it's very different kinds of filmmaking. Because like you're not going to see a Spielberg or a Nolan or a Villeneuve doing documentaries. Like they are movie makers, and
Yeah.
somebody like John Ford could do both those kinds of things. Obviously, a lot of them were more focused, but
Right.
still. And I have a few obviously documentaries to get through throughout this journey. But Jim, were there any other things that you wanted to bring up about This Is Korea?
Let's go with two things.
Okay.
Are you going to go with, or are you going to cover rather the film called Directed by John Ford, the documentary directed by John Ford,
I went through his whole entire IMDb when I did that,
1971?
and I looked up every film that I could find at the time, and that's what's on my list. That is not one of them.
Okay, okay.
Well,
I
actually,
just
this
Martin
that
Scorsese is one of the people. It looks like one of those typical like um, they get everybody and anybody who's recognizable to just say, "Give me a soundbite about this guy," you know?
about John Ford. Yeah,
Yeah, but Scorsese's comments might be interesting because it was filmed in 71. So like he was I don't even know
that was
why they
right
decided
before Mean
Scorsese was a
Streets.
guy to put in there because he was super young. But
Yep, super early in his career too. Yeah, because like
yeah,
looking at IMDb, it jumped from Seven Women that came out in 1965, and then jumped straight to Chesty, A Tribute to a Legend in 76.
76. Okay.
So like there's a huge gap. Realistically, John Ford really stopped filmmaking for the most part in the mid 60s, which
Yeah.
makes sense. That was still 50 years. of
Right.
making films,
That's yeah. It's a
which
lot of
is
time
ridiculous.
and a lot of change to see.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. My other question was, did you catch that question? The narrator, not sorry, it wasn't a question. The narrator was like, "Hey, you nuns, don't smoke your dope." They were like herding the kids into the care of some nuns, and then the narrator, every now and then he would drop into like vernacular and say something um like brass monkey, or I don't know, something in everyday English, and then he told the nuns not to smoke their dope, and I was like, what does that mean? I don't
Sounds
understand.
racist. Just making the like it sounds like making the assumption that like Korean people can't help their own because they're all drugged up. Which,
That's crazy. Because they're smoking opium because they're Asian.
yes,
Wow. Okay.
um, yeah, not all of these age very well in many ways. And it's so interesting, especially with like those kinds of things with Native Americans. There's such a range in how Native Americans are treated in John Ford Westerns because there's some that it's really respectful, and then some it's just like, this feels like bare minimum, uh, or less. Um, Obviously, like his more like at this point in his filmography, I feel like the worst is like bare minimum respect. Um, it- and I'm really looking forward to because like now I'm in the 50s. I'll be getting to The Searchers in a month or two, which will be exciting because that's my favorite John Ford film. And that's such an interesting, complex look at human beings because, the person we follow the most is a piece of shit, that
Hmm.
Ethan Edwards. And basically, him and Scar, the main Native American chief, there's two sides of the same coin. So, but obviously, this film was being very outwardly prejudiced against Korean people to, make us feel better. So, lovely. But that's another documentary here on Welcome to the Wasteland for John Ford. I think I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be doing The Quiet Man next week. So, one of John Ford's personal favorite films of, getting to highlight his Irish heritage, as both of his parents were Irish immigrants. But let's get into our recommendations. So, Jim, what did you want to recommend to people?
Well, we started the show with a Sundance film, good one that's coming out this week. I figured I'd recommend another Sundance film that's coming out next week with a wide release called Didi, which is Chinese for little brother. um, Coincidentally, or incidentally, I guess, also the name of Chinese Uber. Didi is the guy you call to come pick you up when you've had too much to drink. Um, it is a I'd say semi-personal, but very intimate story of a Chinese American boy growing up in Southern California. So there's a lot of skateboarding references. It's very much about family relationships. There's an older sister, there's a distant father, there's a mother who's very present. And then kind of navigating social, uh, networks in the pre-internet age. No, not pre-internet. Sorry, this was like early YouTube. This was very
Yes.
early,
Oh,
and that does play a role, or has a part in the movie. Like YouTube videos. So there's a little bit of nostalgia too, I guess, for anybody that can remember like early days of YouTube. Um, yeah, I enjoyed it. It's charming. Go see it, like it, hate it, comment
I
on
am
it.
there's two films that got limited releases that I'm still chomping at the bit to check out, and Didi's one of them, and Sing Sing, starring Coleman Domingo. I'm really looking forward to both those films, and hopefully, so Didi should be coming around next week. Um, around these parts. So I'm looking forward to checking that out. So I have my standard three recommendations. So a new film that I want to recommend is Made in England, the films of Powell and Pressburger. So this is a documentary focusing on the films of Powell and Pressburger, who I personally have become a humongous fan of. Um, I distinctly remember watching one of their films for the first time. I was on a drive to North Carolina uh, to see my nephews pre-pandemic with my brother, and I watched like so many movies on my phone on this trip. And I'm trying to remember if it was, I think it was still, it was either Filmstruck had died already and they launched the Criterion channel is one of them. And I watched Black Narcissus. And
Hmm.
that's a film that I've watched once in my life and it left such an impact on me that it's still in like my top 50 favorite movies.
Was
It
that
is.
made by Powell and Pressburger?
Mhm.
I didn't
Their
know that.
their big three are A Matter of Life and Death, aka Stairway to Heaven, Black Narcissus, and The Red Shoes. And The Red Shoes I've watched twice. I watched twice last year, and it just blew me away. They've made some of the most incredibly beautiful films of all time. And basically this documentary is Martin Scorsese sitting down, talking to the camera, analyzing their films on screen. They're going film to film to film, the diving into their films, the meaning, the filmmaking techniques, and also the influences on Scorsese. Like the reason that one of the main influences on Raging Bull and how he shot the boxing scenes were because of the ballet in the middle of the Red Shoes, where
Hmm.
he visualized Jake LaMotta as a dance in the ring and just this pure cinema. And there's so many influences that are so impactful. And because of the Red Shoes, Martin Scorsese has been drawn to those more manipulative and just amoral type characters in his films that so many of them are between Jake LaMotta and Travis Bickle and Rupert Pupkin and these characters that have become like Henry Hill and William Cutting, these characters that have become so synonymous with Scorsese and the films that he makes. It's just so fascinating. You're listening to a genius of film analyze the films of two geniuses of film. And it's such an engrossing thing. And also, there's a deep personal connection because Martin Scorsese became friends and a mentee of Michael Powell in the mid 70s. And to the point where, like, Michael Powell was part of his life at his worst moments. Michael Powell married Thelma Schumacher, the editor who's done like all of Scorsese's films, and just this deep connection. It was such an engrossing and impactful documentary. If you love film, this is one of those kinds of films where you got to check it out, and hopefully, you go check out Powell and Pressburger's actual filmography too. Um, and now for something completely different. Something on my watch list that I watched was Crimewave, which was the follow up for Sam Raimi to Evil Dead.
Hmm.
And this was co written by Sam Raimi and the Coen brothers. It is a wild, outlandish, slapstick, strange, offbeat amalgamation of like period piece and crime thriller noir with crazy violence and over the top ridiculousness. Am I going to say it's a great movie? Technically, no. But it's an insanely good time. It's such a messy film narratively, but you just see that manic energy of Sam Raimi, his penchant for slapstick comedy in like the darkest ways possible. And
Hmm.
it's just such a wild watch. I had a blast with it. And then a film that wound up the one of my last recommendation is one of my movies that I rewatched for my Wasteland review request for this month, which was So I Married an Axe Murderer.
Hmm.
This is the one film, like one comedy that Mike Myers did in between Wayne's World and Austin Powers, which is such an interesting thing to think about. And like, is the story while you're watching this movie? No. It it's tinges of rom-com, it's tinges of murder mystery. But what really gets you is just how funny and manic this movie is. Mike Myers plays his own father, this Scottish immigrant who is so Scottish. Um, it's obviously the Shrek voice before it was attached to Shrek, and the ridiculousness that comes out of his mouth. And there's some great cameos too, like Phil Hartman, Charles Grodin, Michael Richards, and some really funny, like random appearances of comedic actors that get some great laughs. It's a fun, weird, quirky kind of film, and it's from 1993 and has like the most 90s soundtrack you're ever gonna listen to.
Hmm.
And it just takes you right back to the 90s because my brother listens to so much 90s music now, and we have a shared Spotify playlist where it's like you can mix with somebody, and that's all it is. It's all 90s
It's all
music and
90s
early
music.
2000s.
He's stuck.
He is stuck. But so those are my recommendations, and that's another episode of Welcome to the Wasteland. Hopefully, you'll tune in next week where our buddy Vinny from the movie club will be joining me to talk about The Quiet Man. But Jim, thank you so much for coming on and chatting movies with me.
You're welcome, Shane, as always.
Absolutely. And as of right now, I don't have Jim on for another John Ford film, so this might be the end of our journey with John Ford, unless he wants to pick another one at some point. But that's for off camera. But thank all of you out there for always tuning in and supporting your Wasteland reviewer.